Hello, everyone, and welcome to my first in probably maybe a series of videos going over and analyzing some of the arguments that have come up during the debate that I had with Florida. So what I'll do is I'll play a bit of or parts of each of his arguments, and then I will provide an analysis as well as a counter argument to what he says. And this is the first point he makes in his opening.
I want to begin by saying if there's no God, no intelligent divine being, then by default, time, matter, and space was preceded by the evolutionary process of this infinite and progressive primordial soup having been the cause for all things. And if this evolutionary process is, quote unquote, the cause for all things, then logic should confirm that life, intelligence, consciousness, morality, emotion, and the human will are all products of this mysterious unknown theory.
All right, so this is a lot, but let me start off with just mentioning that throughout this debate, Florida conflates evolution, abiogenesis, and the Big Bang Theory together. What he really means here is naturalistic explanations. That's what he means when he says evolution in this case. But besides that error, he makes a false dichotomy here where he's saying that it's either God explaining everything or there's a naturalistic explanation. And he calls it evolution, of course. Now, the correct dichotomy would be that either God is the explanation for these things or God is not the explanation. But the way he presents it, just ruling out one explanation, the naturalistic explanation, that doesn't mean that by default that the correct explanation is God. For example, you can't say that what's in my pockets is either a ring or it's God. And because it's not a ring, it has to be God. That's the kind of a false dichotomy that he's using here. And no one here is saying, or no scientist is saying that evolution is the cause of all these things that he mentions. What evolution does is it gives a naturalistic explanation of how these things might arise. I mentioned this later in the debate, but besides life, which is addressed by abiogenesis, the other things that are explained by evolution is intelligence, consciousness, morality, emotion, the human will, etc. All these things have biological components. And if we say that they do, or if we say that there is an evolutionary explanation for these things, what we would see is that this in other animals, that these characteristics have evolved not just in humans but in other animals. For example, we would see different species, and we would see them with different levels of, for example, intelligence. We would see other animals that show different levels of morality and complexity of emotions. And evolution would make these predictions, and we would see that this is true. There are other animals with these characteristics at various levels. We see it especially in social animals. For example, hyenas, rats, and of course chimps. Now, these are not the products of a mysterious unknown theory. If there's a theory, it's by definition not unknown, and it's not mysterious, as the point of science is to delve into these unknowns and try to figure out what the naturalistic explanations for these things might be. Science doesn't just give up and say, these are mysterious, therefore God. All right, moving on. So then next he makes an argument, that he's made many times of how intelligence comes from intelligence, life from life, etc., etc. Let's listen.
This train of thought is extremely ludicrous. Please allow me to illustrate. The following are clear, observable scientific patterns we witness daily. Life produces life, consciousness from consciousness, morality from morality, emotion from emotion, will from will. What I described is simply the act and process of procreation through childbirth. Can non-life produce life? Can non-consciousness produce consciousness? Can something non-intelligent produce intelligence? Can something non-moral produce morality? Can something non-emotional produce emotion? And lastly, can something without will produce will? The simple and scientific answer is absolutely not. We have zero, no observable evidence for the preceding questions, none whatsoever.
Okay, to start off, I don't get a sense that Florida did any kind of extensive research to determine that there is in fact no scientific evidence of these things. I may be wrong, but I don't think he did. And I say that because there are certainly a lot in the scientific literature about how these things like consciousness, intelligence, morality, etc., how these things could have naturalistic explanations. And I mentioned this previously. And I'll remind our listeners here again that even if we don't have a naturalistic explanation for these things, it just means that we don't know. It doesn't mean that, oh, since we don't know, we're going to have to conclude by default that it must have been God. That's not how science works. That's not how anything works. But of course, he moves forward with these fallacies, and then concludes that the only logical conclusion is that all these things must have some kind of quote unquote intelligent uncaused cause. And by the way, I cut out a little bit of him quoting a Psalms verse, as I don't think a Bible verse is an evidence. So we'll move on to his next clip.
The only logical conclusion for the existence of all things is there must, I repeat, there must be an intelligent uncaused cause. This uncaused cause, okay, must possess great intelligence in order to think, create, design, speak, express emotion, and exert will, thereby demonstrating the personal characteristic of consciousness, which clearly defines a person, not a thing or a process. In other words, God is the uncaused cause, whom by nature is eternal, without beginning or end.
All right, so Florida here is making the cosmological argument for God. This isn't really about creationism, at least not directly. But these are all claims. God is being defined into existence by claiming that it's the uncaused cause. And God's an uncaused cause. Why? Because God is eternal. We're to believe that there is this complex entity that's all powerful and all knowing and has a will and motivation to care about what a bunch of organisms on a small planet in the corner of a universe might be doing behind closed doors. And this complex entity just has always existed. This is laziness. Instead of making an argument, it's just falling into this special pleading so that you don't have to explain how God came about. You just say that God always existed. But as soon as you say that the universe has always existed, they bring out the objections. And they can bring out the objections because of science. But science really doesn't say, what caused everything. The Big Bang Theory basically just say, it just starts at the point where very hot, dense energy started expanding. We don't know anything that happened before it. We don't know where that energy came from. We don't know what caused the expansion. But why can't we just say, or why can't science just say that universe is eternal? It's always existed. Well, because you can use the special pleading only for God, because obviously God's special. All right, so now let's go to his next argument.
Okay, at this point, I can hear you guys screaming, Abiogenesis. Okay, you want Abiogenesis? You got it. Here we go. This article entitled The Experimental Basis for Abiogenesis, this is from sciencing.com, dated June 4th, 2019, quote, in the early 1950s, American graduate student Stanley Miller and his graduate advisor Harold Urey decided to test their abiogenesis theory by recreating an early Earth environment. They mixed the simple compounds and elements from the theory in air and discharged sparks through the mixture. The article goes on to discuss the specific methods used, whereby the article ends with this statement, quote, these experiments were unsuccessful, end quote.
Well, to start, I doubt anyone was screaming abiogenesis or abiogenesis, however way you want to pronounce it. But this is where things get hairy for Florida. It took me a while to find what journal he was quoting because I thought at first he meant science.com, the research journal Science. No, it's actually sciencing.com. And once I found that article, I figured out what was going on here. Now, I, as well as many others, have accused Florida of cherry-picking quotes, and this is actually a great example of this. What he describes here is, it really is how science works. Someone reports a finding and others try to build on it. And so what the article is saying is that after the Miller-Urey experiment was reported, other scientists tried to build on it. And what they were trying to find was that they were trying to create replicating molecules from the amino acids that came from the Miller-Urey experiment. So they wanted to see if they can create proteins. And the article says that was unsuccessful at the time. And actually, the article even goes on to say that further research found that some of the assumptions on the prebiotic conditions on the Earth was incorrect, which actually brought into question the results of the Miller-Urey experiment. Now, this is where the quote mining issue comes in, because if you continue on reading the rest of the article, it says, quote, since then, some experiments using a corrected atmosphere composition have also found organic molecules such as amino acids, thus supporting the original conclusions, unquote. So they're basically saying that even with the revised assumptions, the Miller-Urey experiment still was validated. And then other experiments for replicating molecules from those amino acids, they were more successful because of the corrected assumptions. What Florida quotes or quoted implied that all the experiments, the entire Miller-Urey experiment was unsuccessful, when in fact that's not what the article said. And that is an example, at least from my point of view, of quote mining. So now let's go to the next set of quotes that he brings up.
Furthermore, Popular Mechanics, titled How Did Life Spring Up from Non-Life? This is dated April 19, 2022. Quote, scientists have continually tried to pinpoint the exact origins of life on Earth. One of the leading theories is that life emerged from the chemical processes in the Earth's early ocean. Simple chemical precursors such as water, carbon, and hydrogen mixed and mingled until they formed complex polymers like DNA, RNA, and protein, which are the building blocks of life. But scientists are still waiting for proof that these chemical ingredients can spontaneously assemble themselves, become wrapped in a membrane, and divide. In other words, there is still a missing link between the chemistry of early life and its subsequent biology, end quote.
Okay, this isn't necessarily a quote mining example, but it's rather just a misunderstanding of abiogenesis. No abiogenesis scientists would say that they have the proof that these biomolecules, once formed, can then become a self-replicating cell. Instead, what they have are different hypotheses of how this could have happened. There are several competing hypotheses, and there's actually quite a bit of research into the RNA world theory, which says that ribonucleotides were able to polymerize to form RNA strands, and there's research that demonstrates that these RNA strands could have had enzymatic properties, and enzymatic properties, as in being able to facilitate replicating, splitting, and joining of RNA strands. Those are called ribozymes, RNA with enzymatic properties. And then once you get these ribozymes, you would eventually get to DNA and then to protein. Now, these are hypotheses because science doesn't have a definitive proof that this happened. But that's only because science doesn't just lead to conclusions without evidence. For example, scientists wouldn't say that, hey, since we don't have proof of this, it must be God. That's not how science works. All right, then Florida then continues on.
Please note that this article discussed the Earth's ocean containing water, carbon, and hydrogen, where these compounds and elements were already present, therefore requiring a pre-existent cause, quote unquote. The point is, abiogenesis remains an unproven hypothesis at best.
Now, I found this argument very puzzling because what he's saying is that abiogenesis is wrong because it describes a process where abiotic molecules like water, carbon, and hydrogen, that these are then converted into biomolecules. That's actually what abiogenesis is. And the fact that you have to have some starting material doesn't make abiogenesis faulty. Abiogenesis is in the science of how uh, biomolecules can just come from nothing at all. Of course, you have to have a starting point. And yes, it's an quote unquote unproven hypothesis. As I said before, because we can't absolutely have a proof of exactly how life came about. It's just we just have a lot of plausible explanations of how it could have arrived, and considering that we have plausible explanations, there is no need to jump to therefore God, because you have to assume a lot of things for you to be able to say that the cause, quote unquote, was God. Okay, now finally, Florida gets to discussing evolution.
Okay, moving forward to defining the term evolution. Quote, the process by which different kinds of living organisms are, quote unquote, thought to have developed and diversified from earlier forms during the history of the earth, end quote. That's from Oxford Languages. As mentioned, evolution by definition uses pre-existing material organisms to propagate its theory of simple forms progressing to more complex forms over time, whereby operating in the material, the tangible, not the immaterial, not tangible.
Okay, so him bringing in a definition from the Oxford Language Dictionary, I guess he did it just because that particular definition had, quote unquote, dot. Um, I guess just to stress that evolution is just a theory, I guess. I'm not sure. But what's really strange here is that he's pointing out that evolution works on pre-existing material organisms. And I think this is where he's saying this because he's conflating abiogenesis with evolution. Of course, evolution works on existing material organisms. And that's the point that I make later on in the debate, that it doesn't, for evolution, it doesn't matter how that life came about, whether it had naturalistic causes or whether it was created by God. The point is you get an organism that can propagate, that can pass on its heritable traits. And when that happens, that's where evolution comes into play. So his explanation really isn't an argument against evolution. It really isn't an argument against anything. And then here's the last point he makes in his opening.
Therefore, it's extremely illogical to assume that a quote unquote material process can produce the quote unquote immaterial personal characteristics of intelligence, morality, personality, emotion, and will. Okay, Q, I'm going to turn it over to you, man.
All right, so then he wraps up his opening by again pointing out that these quote unquote immaterial characteristics, such as intelligence, morality, personality, emotion, etc., I think he's saying that these things can only come about by God creating it or designing it into us and other animals, I guess, and that it's not possible for these things to come about from physical sources. Um, he he can't imagine that a brain uh, could evolve to the point where it's able to develop language, and from language develop intelligence, morality, personality, etc. As I said before, all those things have biological connections. So if you damage the brain, you can actually affect intelligence, affect morality, personality, emotions, etc. You can have drugs that have that effect. So to say that you somehow can only have an immaterial sources for those things, it just flies in the face of evidence. And there isn't anything logical to say that these things could only come about from non-tangible things. I think most people will say that, for example, consciousness is just an emergent property of the brain activity. So it definitely has a material source for what we kind of call consciousness that conceptually is not a material thing. Um, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's some logic that says that uh, the causes of those things or the source of those things have to be material. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up at least the opening. This actually took longer than I thought. So thanks for everyone that stuck through all these. I tried to make this a little bit quicker by speeding up what Florida, his portion of the audio. And I didn't take too much out of his whole thing. So if anyone is interested in listening to the entire debate, it's in my live section. I am not sure if I'll do the rest of the debate. I guess I'll see if there's any interest in hearing that, and how many people actually watch this. But thanks again, and I'll see you guys in the comments.